Hello and welcome to another episode of the Smart Freight Center Academy podcast, where we share interesting and important information and updates about freight decarbonization and the drive towards the zero emissions logistics industry. My name is Andy Golding. I'm the head of Academy here at Smart Freight Center, or SFC, as you'll hear us call it, and I'm your host for today. Today, we're talking about maps, specifically sustainable logistics roadmaps, which serve as your organization's guide to actionable and implementable decarbonization efforts. The SFC Academy offers a training dedicated to helping you build your very own company-specific SLR, or Sustainable Logistics Roadmap. And today we're digging into why these are so helpful and so important on the journey towards sustainable logistics. Joining me today are Rik Arends, Senior Director here at Smart Freight Center, and Martijn Bakker, a lead consultant focusing on sustainability and logistics at our partner, AllChiefs, who we work with together for the delivery of the Sustainable Logistics Roadmap training. Let's dive into today's episode. Rik, Martijn, it's wonderful to have you both with us here today. To get straight into it, Rik, coming to you first. Maybe you can tell us a little bit, just maybe set some context for us. We know that shifting to sustainable logistics is complex and a map matters, but maybe you could say a little bit more about this.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. And it's wonderful to be with you here today and Martijn to join on this particular podcast on sustainable logistics roadmap. How do we advance those as well? Because your sustainable logistics roadmap is a critical path and a critical kind of navigation towards achieving your targets that you've set. As an organization, every organization is facing several risks that they need to mitigate. And one of those risks is actually what is going to be the environmental impact of their operations in the future. And climate science is pretty evident that we need to reduce our carbon emissions and reduce our logistics emissions in response to that. And a sustainable logistics roadmap really acts as your guiding navigation, how to navigate it. How are you going to handle this over time? And therefore it's so important that we get that right.
Thanks, Rik. Martijn, maybe you want to also say a few words about a roadmap, what it is and why it's critical.
Yeah, sure. And also, thanks for having me as a guest on this podcast. Very cool. If I look at an SLR, a Sustainable Logistics Roadmap, it's a translation of a firm's decarbonization strategy towards action. There's an idea, there's a target. We need to do something about the climate and we need a plan to do it. Well, the roadmap is your GPS on this journey, referring to logistics terminology here. For us, it's really important that companies have this roadmap because it gives guidance. It gives clarity on, okay, what should I do first? What do I do later? What should come after that? So it gives a view on priorities. How should we make decisions? And it should give clarity on who does what. So who is responsible for these projects to be executed? And in the end, it should all end up and translate to meeting this target. So what we've seen, target setting is one thing, developing a strategy is one thing, but really getting a proper plan in place that gives clarity on how to go forward, that's key. And that's really why this roadmap is so important.
So what I'm hearing is essentially the part of the magic and the power of a sustainable logistics roadmap is it's going to help organizations prevent a wheel spin, where we know we need to do something about our emissions. We have these targets. We don't really know where to get started. And so there's this desire for action, but without a clear plan that's broken down into implementable steps, it's very easy to just kind of wheel spin and actually not move forward.
Yes. In a way. And what I also observe is it's almost a learning exercise doing this whole roadmap thing. You push yourself to making conscious decisions about what you do first. When you start this whole decarbonization journey, people have the tendency to jump on the more advanced solutions, and we start talking about electrification and biofuels and hydrogen and everything. Well, thinking about your roadmap in decarbonizing, meeting your targets in a cost-effective way, you might recognize some areas for optimization first. There might be some cost-saving incentives that you do first, or you use those savings to fund investments into more sustainable alternatives. Like, it's really a guiding mechanism. It gives you the rationale to make decisions in terms of priorities, costs, and people. That's for me really the most important piece, yes.
Yeah, and to complement on that, Martijn, actually, I think what is most importantly is not only you may set a lofty goal to get net zero by 2040 or a half a reduction by 2030 itself. But if you really think this through, a good sustainable logistics roadmap is not only mapping out, okay, how do you get there itself, but also how do you set the governance structures, the partners in place, the procedures, how do you set yourself up for success? Because a goal in itself you can set, but if you don't set, like, how do you get there, or how do you actually translate this into business actions, it becomes only a goal which is unachievable and becomes a business pressure.
Rik, I love the wording that you've just used, and I really resonate with that the Sustainable Logistics Roadmap helps organizations set themselves up for success on this journey. Because, as you say, it's easy, I say in very big air quotes, to set lofty goals, but to actually achieve them, a lot needs to happen. So setting yourself up for success really matters. Martijn, given everything that Rik's just shared around, an example of net zero by 2040 and the current situation in the world where we're all starting to shift our focus more to more sustainable ways of working, longer term, more sustainable views, etc. Why is now the time for businesses to be focusing on sustainable logistics?
There's a very easy answer, but there's more to it. It's because waiting isn't an option. You can't wait. Of course, globally, we're living in a volatile world. A lot of changes are happening. And it also taps into what Rik just said before. Like, this is to a lot of people a new subject. You could have been working within logistics for 30 years, but then sustainability in logistics is a different topic. So it's also a learning exercise. It's about getting started. And in the beginning, it's about putting time and effort and thinking into it, starting small, getting those first learnings in. As a company, as the people working within the company, you need this time to make the small mistakes, to get the learning in, and then capitalize on your successes and scale where you are successful. Especially we look at time, looking at near-term targets, especially 2030. It's only 5 years away. And all those multinationals that we work with, they have these procurement cycles. For example, you are a company that is buying logistics services. You do this once a year. So you have 1 year to develop your roadmap. Then you have 1 year to contract them. Then you learn, you do it a year again, and it's already 2028. So there is a certain urgency to start moving right now, to start learning, to make sure that you are ready for the near-term targets in 2030 and the ones that follow thereafter. It's sooner than you think, and especially in global business, things take time to get all stakeholders on board, to get the organization to change, and therefore starting earlier than sooner is really the way to go, to build this learning into the organization and change the way you've been doing work for decades.
Can I challenge a little bit as well, just to provoke as well, because I would mostly with you, but on top of that, actually, I think there is enough being done by quite a few organizations these days in the world on how to do logistics decarbonization. And we see successful examples of companies that have implemented successfully their sustainable logistics roadmap, that have been successfully decarbonizing their logistics operations and have even achieved net zero operations in certain parts of their logistics supply chains. I think the time has come as well that this becomes a business necessity. It is not a time to learn as such, but it's rather to bring it to scale and to really think through, how does this become not only a CSR topic that the sustainability team is willing to pilot a little thing, but how do you bring your full procurement team, your full operations team, your full sustainability team, and your finance team into play on achieving those goals, and not think to not think only small, but really think in a big way. and that is also the sustainable logistics roadmap that you would produce or build is embraced then by senior leadership and is actually finds its way in therefore in all of the investment decisions and management decisions that are taken.
Couldn't agree more, Rik. Totally agree.
Rik, you've just mentioned other departments and other organizational players who we might not traditionally think about when we're talking about the sustainable logistics roadmap, procurement, finance, all of these other departments, operations as well, who, if you think about it on the surface, wouldn't naturally come to mind when we're talking about logistics. But Martijn, you mentioned just now, for people who have been working in logistics for 30 plus years, this idea of sustainable logistics might be completely new. And at the same time, the idea of needing to bring the conversation about sustainable logistics to a much broader group of stakeholders is also probably quite new. Rik, maybe you want to say a few words about just expanding a little bit more on what you were mentioning about the importance of scaling this out, bringing these other stakeholders into the conversation to make sustainable logistics achievable.
For logistics decarbonization, it's not any product is moved hundreds of times around the globe. And that means you need and you use, not only usually you don't use one supplier, you have a multitude of suppliers that you need to work with. And those suppliers usually have another multitude of suppliers. So your tier 1 suppliers may be 10 or 20 or even a few thousand companies, depending on your contracting model. But your tier 2 suppliers is a multitude of those. It easily gets to the 10,000 suppliers. It's impossible for you to simply work and track on an individual supplier basis. So you need to prioritize who are your main suppliers, who are bringing the biggest levers, who are your biggest impacts, who have the biggest greenhouse gas impact on your logistics inventory, and how can you work with those guys to make it happen? If you don't think about that in a prioritization way, you're going to be lost. You really start to think like, okay, I have a bucket of 10,000 suppliers I need to engage with. Where do I start? And if you don't have a good roadmap behind it, or a good way of segmenting your suppliers, or a good way of working with your operational teams that are involved in the day-to-day conversations with your suppliers, you'll never get there.
Martijn, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
It's so true in that sense. Like what I see often happening among our clients is that struggling with decision and prioritization, and people tend to focus on where your original first intuition attention goes. But with regard to developing your roadmap, it forces a decision. And how we always go about this, we are all people with only so much time. Still today, sustainability in logistics is something that comes on top of existing people, their workload. So there is a fixed amount of time that we have to tackle this incredible challenge. So better make it worth our while. So we always go with focus on the big chunks first. What are your must-win battles? And this requires a whole bunch of things, right? So it's about understanding your emission data. What are the biggest contributors to our footprint, and where do we need to make a change to become successful in the long run? But not only logistics data, it's also combining emissions with business practices. Can we find low-hanging fruits? I hate the word, but often true what it is. Quick wins to get the ball rolling. Are there maybe operational constraints? Like, are there maybe some very good arguments why we might be very polluting in certain areas, and the challenges to overcome here might be bigger than others? So it's continuously studying your emission data to give your first guidance and connecting with your broader network, both within your organization, people from different departments, and those are smart people. And probably, if it is the way it is, it's fair to challenge it, but there are probably also some very good arguments behind it. So there's a risk of making the easy assumption, oh, this is the biggest trade lane, let's have the emissions, just do it, that's very easy. No, there's way more complexity behind this, and it's important to have these well-informed decisions, the decision framework upon which you draft your roadmap, and to align those with the people in your company, but to Rik's point, also with all your suppliers and everybody else in their chain. Like, collaboration must happen. You need to understand the actual arguments behind the world is as it is. And then you can think about what you can change.
It was funny to say, like, last week, I hosted a workshop on logistics decarbonization and logistics emissions for Scope 3 practitioners. And what was most telling, we asked, like, so how much is your logistics footprint of your overall greenhouse gas emissions as a company? Nearly all of them knew the figure on the top of their head. They knew it was 15%, 17%, 13%. Subsequently asked, so do you know where does those emissions come from? Which modes of transport? Only half of them knew which modes of transport were used. That's a very simple starting point. Then on top of that, I asked, so do you know where you travel empty or where your suppliers are traveling empty? Because those are the lanes that you probably have some inefficiencies, or where some form of kind of backhauling as a solution, as a lever, can easily save you money and emissions. None of them had that answer. And that's where some of those little insights can sometimes appear. It's not only about the greenhouse gas emissions itself, it's also understanding then which data point or which other use cases that I'm trying to solve to get that data point in place. And that this exercises and examples really helps you.
Cool.
Based on everything that you've just shared, we've brought in the external stakeholders, the internal stakeholders, the must-win battles, how we're needing to be cost effective. We're looking for optimization. What do we know about the emissions that we're already creating in our logistics operations? How can we optimize? Where might we not be able to optimize? How does a roadmap, a sustainable logistics roadmap, align with long-term business goals and profitability? Because obviously, sustainable logistics can only function within a business that is still profitable, running well, so they have to work hand in hand in the long term. Rik, maybe you want to kick us off with this.
Yeah, it's a very valid question. And I can see two considerations, two slightly different ones. One is that we've seen that businesses that operate on with sustainable logistics, generally speaking, have a better operating margin and more returning loyal customers. So once you've moved into this as being a sustainable company or sustainable logistics company, it's for anyone that is selecting you as a supplier, hard to go back to a different company. So it creates returning loyal customers as a logistics operator. And secondly, what we see as well, and this goes down the route on some of the measures that you can take are actually cost saving. So logistics optimization is usually mentioned, but for example, truck electrification can become a cost saver if you think about this done well in terms of charging infrastructure and deployment. And what we notice sometimes that the long-term transition and the long-term goals really help you anchor in your strategies vis-a-vis, for example, short-term measures that you can take today. And those long-term strategies towards, because we all know roughly how long the future would look like in the long term, and keep that in mind will allow you to have a forward looking on this. And maybe then our final thought, I often quote as well, it's either you pay now or you pay later. And which means if you pay now, it means rather you invest into sustainable logistics and you get a sustainable logistics in place, or you don't and you pay later, which means it doesn't go to you, but it goes to the tax agencies that are putting tax on logistics. We see the compounding effects of different taxation schemes really adding up to significant logistics costs. That will be a driving force for you to a change.
Martijn, I'm seeing you nodding along because I have the luxury of seeing you. So maybe you want to share a little bit about how roadmaps align with our long-term business goals and profitability.
what I was thinking, like to Rik's point, especially the nature of people perceiving sustainability as something new, I see this giving tension. Immediately, people start having these profitability concerns, and of course, like the extent to which you can do things, it very much differs per industry. Whether you're a high margin industry, a fast moving industry, or whether you're lower margin, slower moving, like there are a whole set of criteria that determine how easy this whole journey is for you. But what we recognize across almost all industries, since ever, I think the invention of money, people have been thinking about how they can reduce their costs. And these have been existing practices, and this taps into the optimization piece. And I've seen numerous occasions where companies, they were drafting their sustainable logistics roadmap, but they failed to acknowledge good work that was already being done, good things that were already planned for, right? I have an example of one of our clients. They were planning a whole network restructuring to reduce kilometers, since kilometer reduction equals a cost saving. And they completely neglected it from their roadmap. Well, in reality, this is a big project. The company had invested a lot of money to get a plan in. They've made the estimations in terms of cost saving and kilometer reduction, but there was no emission estimate whatsoever. And I think this is really, in essence, what it means to have this roadmap integrated throughout your entire organization. There are great things happening. They will reduce costs and they will reduce your emissions. But you need to account for it. If you don't do it, it will be either a surprise win, and then you cannot explain the win, or you miss the opportunity. And this has the risk that you might make some wrong decisions. You might invest in acquiring a higher volume of biofuels, potentially at a premium, while if you accounted for some savings that were happening regardless, you could have saved this money. So this illustrates how it is really important to balance all your activities throughout the organization, those that save costs and potentially those that require an investment. I think this is where we are at right now, often neglected, and really would benefit from more attention. But also to Rik's final point, you pay now or you pay later. There is, of course, also this whole adoption thing, and how the future will develop. That's sometimes a challenge. There is ambiguity about how you go about this. But investing now, one, it gives you learning. Secondly, it gives you also strategic access to these scarce resources. If you need, for example, your electric truck, I've seen occasions where it takes a year before you actually have it delivered at your doorstep. So also here, making the investment now will equip you for the future. And then there's, of course, scale advantages and costs will go down. Now we're entering more in the economic side of things. But I think both are true. You need to account for your cost savings now that are already happening, since I can guarantee you there is so much already happening. Second point being, to a certain extent, you pay now or you pay later. And I'm pretty sure that I know what I would prefer right now.
I think one thing that is becoming abundantly clear just listening to you both speak and share your insights is, firstly, sustainable logistics cannot happen in a vacuum, and a sustainable logistics roadmap cannot be built nor executed in a vacuum. There needs to be this organization-wide discussion, conversation, and coming together to really look at what's already happening, what's happening that I wasn't aware of, what's on the cards, and it needs to just kind of be this really robust, well-rounded 360 approach. Since we're coming close to time, Martijn, I'm going to come to you with the last question because we want to end on a high note. I'm wondering if you could share an example of a success story that you've seen with a company developing a sustainable logistics roadmap and where that took them.
Oh, most definitely. I would like to share one example of one of our clients that I can actually name. It's Royal Canin. It's a global pet food producer, and they produce all sorts of products for dogs and cats, and a very, very wide range of products. We've been working with them for 3 years now, and they were at this point what we were discussing a bit earlier. Okay, we have a target. We need to do something about our logistics footprint. How are we going to do this? And what I really like here is with our approach, they really follow this principle of we should onboard the whole organization. So they've been working on getting a bottom-up roadmap approach. And I will explain a little bit what that means. Like globally, there are differences in what you can do, right? Here in the Netherlands, where I'm dialing in from, distances are short, solutions are better available than they are, for example, somewhere uphill in Brazil, where it's still very much bound to fossil fuel usage and solution availability is lower. This gives an indication that in terms of technological maturity, there are differences across what markets can do. And you need to account for these differences. And then you'll see you can decarbonize everywhere. But you just need to understand this local context. So the first risk is you just move it top down and you don't account for these differences. It will result in friction. With Royal Canin, we developed an approach. Everybody who is responsible for their local operating markets globally must develop their roadmap from now until the near-term target of 2030. It has been quite a challenge. You need to calculate your emissions. You need to understand your data. You need to allocate projects to people and funding, etc. But they've managed to do so. The program has been running for 2 years now. And it's really, really going the right way. There is a lot of engagement on the subject at all organizational levels. They continuously share learnings and celebrate successes. And their decarbonization figures are tipping towards like double digits percentual reduction. I cannot be specific, unfortunately, but they have had great learning, great success. And I think they can really be an example. And it all started with very, very strong acknowledgement from leadership that it is important. Set up the plan, equip the people, set them up for success that we mentioned earlier, and then let the learning journey roll and start scaling where you are successful. I think it's a great example of which we and they are very, very proud.
That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. It's also really nice to hear a real world application of something that I think on the surface can maybe feel a little bit complex and hard to wrap your head around. Rik, as I say, complex and hard to wrap your head around, maybe just before we close out, you want to say a few words about our Develop Your Sustainable Logistics Roadmap training that we offer here at Smart Freight Center and the Smart Freight Center Academy, and how it might be helpful and meaningful for anybody whose interest has been piqued or curiosity has been tweaked by this conversation.
Yeah, so absolutely, because what we've seen is that companies that have passed through this training course, and we've trained several cohorts over the years now, and you've seen those organizations that really have sent a large cohort to this training and subsequently engaged on this topic, started to have a clear understanding of and a clear baseline on how does a sustainable logistics roadmap look like, and have all the building blocks, foundational knowledge that are needed to build their own sustainable logistics roadmap. Those usually we see organizations that have not done this lack the kind of understanding of the landscape of logistics decarbonization, lack the understanding of the clear steps to follow or the procedures and the governance around this. They know pockets of a sustainable logistics roadmap, but not know the whole story behind this. And that's what the SLR and Sustainable Logistics Roadmap training course really helps you, is understand all the building blocks that are required to get you to a net zero sustainable logistics target. Throughout the training as well, we combine that theoretical level of what are the steps to take, as well as practical exercises and examples of companies that have implemented this to make you empowered and understand how to put this forward.
And one of the superpowers of our training, I think, is the fact that you leave the training with your roadmap. You go through the learning of what it is, how to create it, and then actually creating your roadmap. So you're leaving with something physical. To not spend too long talking about just our training, I think we're going to wrap today's episode here. Thank you to both of you, Rik, Martijn, for what's been a really interesting conversation. We could probably continue this conversation for the next few hours, but if I were to summarize, sustainable logistics roadmap, it cannot happen in a vacuum. It is the critical guideline, and Martijn, to use your words, GPS for your organization to get from here to decarbonized. And learning how to create this roadmap is absolutely critical in the decarbonization journey. Rik, Martijn, thank you so much for joining us today. That brings us to the end of our episode on sustainable logistics roadmaps.